This presentation is part of a series of 3 videos. They can be viewed in any order. The aim is to explore the foundations of using acupuncture based on palpatory findings, as well as common mistakes made. This series is not about imparting new technical information, such as the use of specific protocols and points, but rather to look at general guiding principles. This video focuses on the general principles of using abdominal findings as diagnosis and as a way to confirm treatment choices. Though I use the term abdominal findings, a more correct term would probably be palpatory findings, because when I say abdominal findings, I mean all palpatory findings, including the neck, the throat, and the back, as well as the abdomen. The term abdominal findings or Hara diagnosis rolls off the tongue more naturally than whole body palpatory findings. So do bear in mind that when I use the term abdominal findings, it usually does mean whole body palpatory findings and not just the abdominal findings. In Japan, it is customary to present diagnostic patterns with an associated abdominal findings. It is perhaps the equivalent of the Chinese inclusion of a description of a tongue when presenting a case. It does not, however, mean that the abdomen is the most important diagnostic tool in all styles of Japanese acupuncture. While the various Japanese styles are all famous for palpation, what is emphasized is often palpation of points, finding the precise point, etc. In many cases, the abdomen is a bit of a sideline, and one can see many Japanese masters check the patient's abdomen rather quickly, almost to nod to an obligation, include it in the presentation of the diagnosis, and then ignore it as they proceed with the treatment. Also, the actual mechanics of the palpation can be quite different between styles. As a result, there are many representations of abdominal diagnosis that represent different thought systems and styles and present different maps. Those who practice what is termed Kiiko Matsumoto style place a much stronger emphasis on the abdomen, and abdominal findings are used both for diagnosis and for confirmation. This is probably the most obvious aspect of this style, or perhaps the most visible aspect. Beginners are often taught to use certain points in order to clear certain findings. It takes a while to recognize that there is more to it than simply treat point X for finding A. We all like simple solutions and to utilize textbook descriptions. A dogma is created because it works in enough cases. Unfortunately, while that can really work like a charm, there are many times when one needs a deeper look. What's wrong with using the abdomen as the main diagnosis? And what else should we be using? There's nothing wrong with using the abdomen as the main diagnostic tool, as long as it is combined with more methods. Let's not forget that we do have 4 diagnostic tools in our toolkit: questioning, observing, palpating, and using smell and sound. We should employ as many of these tools as we can. The advantage of the abdominal palpation is that first, it can be simple and not require specialized skills, and secondly, it easily lends itself to confirming the treatment, something most of the other diagnostic tools do not offer. These are tremendous advantages which I exploit constantly. Still, my advice is to correlate palpatory findings with all the other diagnostic methods, and this is the main thrust of this presentation. One can develop skill in feeling and interpreting the abdomen, the neck, and the back. With time, one does develop the sense of what different areas tend to feel like when indicating disorder and what they feel like when there's no disorder. However, unlike palpation of the pulse, one can get the information required without much experience. In fact, I recommend relying primarily on patient feedback. The only skill one should develop is the ability to press on the patient's body gently, firmly, and be able to replicate the pressure consistently. Use your whole body to move into the abdomen and not just your hand. On the abdomen, I recommend that you use 3 fingers, the index, middle, and ring fingers, and press them all in, directing the pressure from the back of your heart and out through the shoulder, elbow, and the wrist. Do not just press with your hand, as this tightens the fingers and tends to be uncomfortable for the patient. Press with your whole body. I have 3 fingers pressing, so the pressure is distributed between them, again making it more comfortable. But my concentration is on my middle finger, which for me happens to be more sensitive. On the abdomen, one can generally get to the depth of 1 knuckle. You do not want to go any deeper. Any area that the patient says is uncomfortable or painful at that depth is considered to be a positive reflex. I usually start by pressing on an area of the abdomen that is unlikely to be painful, so that the patient has an understanding of what the baseline is. On most patients, the left spleen line, say below spleen 14, tends to be inactive. This is not true if the patient has colitis or other colon issues. Sometimes you might feel tightness, but the patient says it feels fine. In that case, press another area, or 2, or even 3 other areas, so the patient can start to have a comparison of what is tight, what is not tight, what is painful, what is not. Sometimes they can't tell the difference. Sometimes that does not register either by pressing different areas, and only when you release the pressure or the tightness at a particular spot, then the patient realizes that, oh yeah, that was actually tighter, because now they can feel what it is like to not have tightness. With some patients, we do need to be very patient and repeat, because they do not register the sensations in the body so easily. The throat, meaning the SCM and the scalenes, are palpated differently. On the SCM, I use the flat part, the palmar part of my fingers, rather than the tips. So about 2/3 of my finger's length is laid against the SCM, and then I press it in. The scalenes are pressed with a tip, but somewhat more dulled and slightly more dulled than the abdomen by using the more round part of the tips. So it's almost a combination of using the tip pressing and the flat of the fingers pressing. The advantage of using the patient's feedback and not just what you're feeling is that when you release the area, the patient is the one that's telling you that it is released. This means that the patient now recognizes that something positive is happening, and it serves a bit like a placebo, an encouragement, and it builds trust in the patient. Many patients want to compare and prioritize the pain on different reflexes. They're used to being asked to evaluate the pain on the scale of 1 to 10. This is not what we're looking for in the abdomen. Each positive reflex is a 10. I'm not asking the patient to compare the 10 at REN 12 and the 10 at REN 6. Each one is an independent entity. A 10 simply means I feel discomfort, and 0 means no problem, I just feel your hand like anywhere else. Later, when I press on a treatment point, the 10 can start coming down until hopefully it gets to 0. But it always starts at a 10. In other words, there is no universal 10. There is only a universal 0. Each reflex is a 10 if it is a positive reflex. When I attempt to release the reflex, I will ask the patient how much better the reflex feels now that I'm pressing on a treatment point and on the reflex as well. Some patients find it easy to say, oh, now it's a 2. Some will give it as a percentage, oh, it's 80% better. Some cannot differentiate much subtlety and can only say something like half better or gone. Some of them can say 3/4 or a quarter better or something like that. Some patients, until the pain is fully gone, cannot give you any evaluation. All they can say is, I can still feel it. Sometimes you have to work with that too. Work with whatever system the patient can relate to the most easily. We're trying to talk to the patient's body, but we need their mouths to tell us. This means that the brain will easily get involved on the way between the body and the mouth. And we're now dependent on the patient's brain-body connection, which is not always clear and is often obscured. While this may sound complex, it is by far simpler than palpating and interpreting the pulse. It really is quite simple. And what the first big advantage of the abdomen palpation is really it's that it's simple to use, and the level of concentration and sophistication are relatively low in comparison with taking the pulse. Then there is confirmation, the other advantage. The tongue does not change on the spot. I'm not aware of any practitioner who claims to be able to press or needle a point and immediately see changes in the tongue. Some highly skilled pulse experts can feel immediate changes in the pulse when pressing or needling a treatment point, therefore confirming the treatment. But that is not an easy skill to learn. And while many Japanese-style practitioners claim to have acquired the skill, in my observation, very few discern more than what they already expected that point to actually do. The problem with pulse confirmation is that the pulse is always changing. So having the confidence that me pressing on a point is the one and only reason the pulse changed is a level of confidence I do not have. If you're confident in your pulse taking at the level of confirming treatment points through it, you probably should use that method over abdominal palpation. However, remember that the patient cannot read or interpret their pulse. They can, however, feel their abdomen when pressed. The abdomen, being less subtle than the pulse, offers us the advantage of the patient participation. And we can demonstrate to the patient that here, you can feel it yourself. Something is changing. There is a common perception that one can diagnose by using the abdomen and treat accordingly. I think this is a bit of a mistake. The way you clear abdominal findings is dependent on the medical history. So you need to know the medical history in order to address the abdomen in the most intelligent and patient-specific way. If you rely on abdominal findings only, it is like driving and seeing through only a section of your windshield. Some pulse practitioners, especially when they have just mastered the art, like the idea of simply taking the pulse and not asking the patient anything. Rather, they now tell the patient what they feel in the pulse. Many patients like that also. It is a bit of a game, like let's see how much you can see through the pulse and how correct it will be. At one stage, I was playing with that also, and then I realized that it would be a lot faster for the patient to just tell me their medical history instead of me guessing it from their pulse. And that all the effort I was putting in was more of a smokes and mirror, a show that made me feel like I was a shaman or a fortune teller, but it really didn't get me that much closer to a better treatment. Correlating the various diagnostic methods is the better way. It may feel less impressive, but it is more comprehensive and safer. So yes, we can palpate the abdomen, and having a map of which area reflects what, we can then say, this is adrenal, this is digestion reflex, this is anxiety reflex, this is immune reflex. So the abdomen gives us some diagnostic pointers. But the biggest advantage is that these palpatory findings now give us a way to get immediate feedback on the effectiveness of our treatment. When I find pressure, say, below the right ribs, I associate that with the liver. But it might not be a liver. Maybe the diaphragm is tight or something. So now I press on liver 1 or some other liver point that I'm associating with treating the liver. And if the pressure pain under the right ribs disappears or is significantly reduced, then I can say it's liver, but what I really know, ultimately, is that liver 1 is a good point for this patient. For me, the use of the abdominal findings for confirmation is more important than their use for diagnosis. In fact, I try not to diagnose at all. I do not name any of the reflexes I found until I find the right points that reduce or eliminate them. Practitioners often email me describing a case they want a fresh perspective on. I always ask that the case includes both abdominal findings and medical history. Most practitioners familiar with this style list the findings not as right stomach 26-27 or left stomach 28, but rather as immune reflex and ovary reflex, as if it's a total given, as if it can't be anything else. I recommend against labeling your findings. The moment you label something, it becomes harder to have more ideas about it. The label narrows your view. A reflex can have many meanings. For example, right stomach 26-27 can reflect the appendix, it can reflect digestion, it can reflect immunity, it can reflect lungs, it can reflect the kidney's regenerative capacity, or it can reflect a pelvic shift. It might even reflect none of these and reflect something totally new that I have never thought about. That is a new phenomenon for me. The positive finding, the pressure pain at right stomach 26-27, might reflect one of these things, a combination of them, or perhaps none of these options. Finding a positive reflex does not automatically put the patient in the category of whatever that reflex represents. It might, and it often or usually does, but it might not. The way to ascertain is by finding out what releases the reflex. If a point I associate with immunity releases the reflex, that is when I can say it really does reflect immunity. If a lung-associated point released it, that is when I can say, yes, indeed, this is a lung-related issue. And the same applies to digestion, appendix, kidneys, and pelvic shift. So there are many options on how I release the point, and each one will tell me if that is the diagnosis, if that diagnosis is likely to be correct or not. But then it gets even more complicated, because I might be able to clear the reflex in many ways. In fact, in most cases, there are numerous options of releasing palpatory reflexes. If I name right stomach 26 and 27 as an immune reflex, and I happen to be able to clear it with the immune point, even if stomach 26-27 is now totally free, I cannot tell if perhaps there was also a digestive component. And now I miss my opportunity to find out and to treat the digestion because the reflex has been cleared. It was cleared by the immune point. So naming a reflex can lead me to act a little bit too quickly. This is important because it is actually quite easy to clear abdominal reflexes. I know it does not seem that way at the beginning, But with some experience, it really is easy on the majority of patients to clear reflexes. The trick is not to clear the reflexes, but to affect the problem. We're using the reflexes as a way to gauge whether we are affecting the root problem. If you clear a reflex by addressing a secondary problem, the reflex may well clear fully for a period of time. But the deeper imbalance, which has not been addressed, is still there and may still affect the fascia and produce the reflex a little while later. The fact that the reflex is being created again is not a big deal, but the fact that I did not address the deeper problem is. The trick is always to find the deeper issue, the imbalance that created or affects all other problems. Ideally, we want to find the root cause, the one around which the whole organism's imbalances are hinging on. It is a little like a domino effect. Can you find the one piece, the one domino that will topple all the reflexes? Of course, patients are not dominoes, but the metaphor is useful. The theoretical model is that the patient has experienced some imbalance, an accident, a trauma, an illness, which is not fully resolved. The symptoms of that original issue may not be present any longer, but it has created a weakness, an imbalance in the body. That weakness now allows for newer problems to accumulate because the body is not fully available to deal with them. It is occupied by that previous problem. So again, another episode occurs and perhaps not healed fully. It now creates more knots, and so on and so on. Each assault on the body, be it an injury, an illness, an inherited condition, or whatever, has the potential of becoming an energetic bottleneck. If one addresses a reflex or a problem that is being held by a deeper and older pattern, without addressing the older pattern, the results may not last as long as when one addresses the so-called root, the older patterns. This is not to say that one should only address the root, or that there must only be one root. It is actually quite common for patients to have a number of roots, all of which affect each other and all of which need to be addressed. Finding one root may sound like a great way to go, but clinically it is not the most common. There are usually more than one root that need to be treated. We should not forget that the so-called root, the deeper problem, the older problem, and the branches, the current manifestation, the current complaint, are related in both directions. Of course, the older injury or the constitution is likely to create a holding pattern that does not allow the healing of the current issue, the manifestation, the branches, and hence we want to address it. But while the roots feed the branches also feed the roots. That is why we should always address both. In fact, it's very common that what I call a root now, 10 years later, started as a branch, started as a symptom. It became a root over time, very often. Some practitioners feel that if they address the root, the branches will become healthy on their own. This is not always the case. There is no shame in treating the branches, and the healthier way is to treat the whole organism, the roots and the branches. We just have to do it intelligently. That is where it gets complicated and requires correlating the medical history with the abdominal findings so we can create a strategy and then test it. Before we look at that, I just want to emphasize that the abdominal findings are important, but because they're easy to clear, we should be careful about the way we choose to clear them. Because once you clear an abdominal finding, you can no longer use it in that treatment session as a reflex to confirm or to disprove more treatment ideas. Why do I say abdominal findings are easy to treat or clear when sometimes we're unable to clear them at all? Well, what I'm really trying to say is don't be a slave to the abdominal findings, but use them intelligently. If you bring the patient's knees to his or her chest and apply slight pressure on their shins, supporting the weight of the legs, and ask the patient to breathe into the lower abdomen, this stretches and releases the abdominal fascia. You will find that after doing that for, say, 3 breaths, most of the abdominal reflexes will disappear because we stretch the fascia. This demonstrates how easy it is to release reflexes, but it does not mean that the problem has been treated, does it? So the abdominal findings are easy to clear, and yet they are an indicator. When we clear the abdomen, we get a confirmation that the body is moving in the right direction. It confirms our diagnosis. And yet, because the abdominal findings can be influenced in many ways, the indication is not absolute. It may be incomplete, and it may even be misleading, which is why I always try and clear them in numerous ways and actually need a number of different ways to clear it rather than just one, if I can. Many people learn this style and start using it by palpating the abdomen and then applying the points that are supposed to clear the finding. They treat each reflex as if it was a separate entity. This is what I call use X for Y, kind of like using a cheat sheet or the application of protocols to reflexes. Of course, this method does have some success, but there is a better way. It does feel a bit more complex and harder at the beginning, which is why I recommend you may want to spend a few months, or a few weeks at least, just resolving the abdomen, so as to get used to the mechanics of it. During that period, do whatever you were doing before, whether it's TCM, TAN, 5 elements, whatever style, and also add some points to simply release the abdominal findings. Do it as if it is just a game, not so much as a treatment. You're doing it just to get the experience, the mechanics of clearing reflexes in the abdomen, the palpation and clearing of reflexes. Once you gain some confidence in your ability to address the abdomen, you will have enough of the vocabulary. You will have all the protocols at your fingertips. And now you're ready to introduce the next phase. Of course, that means that you have just become comfortable in palpating and clearing reflexes, and now you're challenging yourself again into a discomfort zone. This time the discomfort zone is the thinking process behind it. When treating a patient, we're always somewhat in unknown territory. We never know in advance if we will be able to help the patient and to what degree. It is being comfortable with discomfort, with not knowing, with being challenged, that makes us a good practitioner. It is that weird balance of having the knowledge, having the confidence, and yet being open to not knowing, to having my knowledge be challenged, even proven wrong, and always be willing to experiment. That is what makes the practitioner a really good one, who is superior to the one applying protocols. The difference is in the way the protocols are applied, in how they are derived, even though both practitioners are using the same set of textbook of protocols of point combinations. Once you have some familiarity with clearing the abdomen, I urge you to not clear the abdomen by dogma or by reflex, and mostly do not clear one reflex at a time. Clear the abdomen by building a strategy. The strategy should ideally clear all the reflexes, not just one or two. Once you applied your strategy, which may consist of 1 or 2 or 3 strategies, that is, when you can go after the stray reflex, the one that were not fully cleared yet by the main strategies. But first, treat your main strategies, the 1, 2, or 3 strategies that you came up with that are supposed to address the patient as a whole. Then you can go after other things. So how do we build our strategy? This is a process that involves 4 steps. The first step is to get the medical history. You want to know what happened to the patient, medically speaking, and have it available to you in chronological order. This is best accomplished by the patient filling it out on their own on a piece of paper and not in a discussion. When patients talk about the medical history, they tend to get distracted. When they write it down at home, they're better able to put it down in bullet form and arrange it. So now you have a general picture of what they have gone through and potential issues, diseases, accidents, operations, traumas, etc., that might serve as root causes to be used in the third step. The second step is to gather all the abdominal findings. Here I mean the abdomen, chest, throat, and neck, as well as meridian palpation. I will usually not palpate the back at this point, except for some areas that come up either from the medical history or from what I found on the abdomen. I can get to most spots on the back with the patient lying face up by simply sliding my hand under the back, but it is not very convenient, so I only look for things that I feel are definitely necessary at this point and cannot wait until I turn the patient over. Because I want to use these back findings as I formulate and test the front treatment, those are the findings that I will try and look for in the back. Otherwise, I leave the back alone. Later, when I do the back treatment, I will be able to refine those findings and also get more findings on the back. It is very important to gather all the findings first. Do not find one reflex and treat it. This is the wrong strategy, in my opinion. Use that strategy only when you're just starting to learn the style. Okay? So you do something like, gee, I found Oketsu. Let me do liver 4 and lung 5. Wow, Oketsu is gone. Cool. Or, I found adrenal. And yeah, kidney 6 and kidney 27 clear it. That's great as a total beginner just to get the practice. This is not a terribly good way of actually treating people as a whole. This kind of experience of doing one thing at one reflex at a time serves to build your confidence and your knowledge base. It's not the best way to treat, and it will fail you in complex patients. Gather all the findings so you know what the patient's abdomen and neck show, and the patient knows and remembers what these areas feel like when you press on them, that they're uncomfortable. Remember to try to not label things quite yet. When you gather the data, let it be data with no interpretation. In the next step, you will be labeling them. And yes, the labeling does come automatically. One often can't help it. That's okay. Just be open to the idea that what you labeled adrenal may end up proving not to be adrenal, or not to respond to the adrenal treatment. That's all. The third step is correlating the medical history and the palpatory findings. What I'm trying to do here is to create a story that explains why the patient has the issues they have, what might have contributed to the imbalance, what issues from the past can still be felt in the abdomen or have logical, physiological connections to current physical findings, be they palpatory or the actual complaint. The story is a way for me to strategize and say, this seems to be most important. This looks like it could be a primary cause that is affecting everything else. I do not limit myself to just one story. The more stories I can make up, the better. I will be testing all these stories to see if they have a good base in reality in the next step. The story will often suggest a strategy. It can be a protocol I already know. This is the most common treatment strategy. I might extrapolate a point or a set of points that work for a different situation, but I feel it is similar and I'm going to see if I can extend it to this situation. I might also come up with a story that I have no clear solution for, so then I have to create treatment protocol, a strategy based on my interpretation of things like point names, functions of the meridians, different holographic reflections within the body, things like that. So now, each story, and there can be several, has some point or points that are supposed to resolve that story. In the fourth step, I test my story. I test my strategy. I press on the point that I associate with the story. If the point helps to release reflexes in the abdomen, I classify the story as valid or true. I test out all the stories I came up with in the third step. I utilize the stories that proved most effective, most valid. Which stories are the most valid, the most effective? If a point clears one reflex in the abdomen, but nothing else, it doesn't look like it represents a main strategy. I might still use that point, but I will give preference to points that represent strategies that clear more reflexes. Sometimes you find one strategy that clears it all, but quite often you will find two or three. Even when I find a strategy that does it all, if I also have other strategies that do a decent job, I will still add those, just in case. It's like taking insurance. Something can look great on the table, but later prove to be not so great. The patient comes back the next week saying that things were good for a few hours or maybe a day, but then they came back relatively unchanged. This suggests that the strategy that I applied did not address the whole picture, even though it cleared all the findings. To minimize this kind of situation where I clear all the findings that the patient looks all fine, but then it all comes back, minimizing this, I prefer to use more than one strategy. Again, just in case. Now here's an interesting twist. We do have textbook knowledge. According to the text, spleen 9, for example, clears right stomach 26-27 if it is related to appendix issues or digestion. Say the patient did have their appendix removed and shows pressure pain on right stomach 26-27. They also have pressure pain on, say, REN 17 and, say, the right SCM. Let's say that spleen 9 did a decent job on right stomach 26-27, but only 75% of the pressure pain is gone. However, that same spleen 9 clears the SCM and clears REN 17 completely. By textbook, the SCM is not related to spleen 9 at all. REN 17, one can say, is related somehow to spleen 9 through the idea of blood pressure issues. What I found now is a point that affects things beyond its official reach. That makes it a primary treatment point. Even though it didn't fully clear the reflex that it's supposed to clear, the point is that it went beyond its reach. Also, a point that affects a reflex on the opposite side suggests that it is more powerful for that patient. I do not mean that it is more powerful than the same point on the same side as the reflex. I mean that this point on both sides now gets some priority in my strategy, because most points in their textbook description do not affect reflexes on the other side. Generally, it is left treats left, right treats right, with some notable exceptions like Sanjiao 8 or Sanjiao 5 and under the third toe. Sometimes spleen 4 will cross over. But generally, we treat same side for same side. So when you find a point that goes beyond its reach, it suggests that this point is essential. It is influential on this patient's body. If after step 4, all the reflexes are fully cleared, the treatment has been formulated, and the points can now be needled. In the case of a pain complaint, and the pain can be reproduced on the treatment table, it is also important that this pain is resolved, however it is produced, by pressure, by movement, or whatever. You want to make sure that the point combinations you are applying do address the symptom, not just clear the abdomen. What if I go through all the different stories and the abdomen is still not resolved? That is when I start making up new stories. I go back to step 3 again and again. I never assume that I have the right story, the best story, just because it matches an abdominal pattern or a portion of the medical history. Patients do not have to come in a pattern that makes sense to me. The body can have its own logic, and it is up to me to study and understand that logic so I can affect that patient's body. I keep going back and forth between steps 3 and 4, creating new stories, new strategies, and testing them. I allow myself to drop any strategy that is not proven by its associated point's ability to release reflexes. And I keep doing that until I find the best strategies that in combination release everything. Ideally, there would be no more than 3 strategies. Otherwise, it very likely means that I did not really find the core issue. And if I cannot do that, if I cannot address all the findings and the symptoms, then I go back to steps 1 and 2. I ask again about the medical history, and I recheck the abdomen to see if I missed something, perhaps dismissed something, and now I need to reconsider it, so I can now create another story with some extra information. This is a very dynamic process that is constantly presenting questions for the patient's body to answer. The answer is supplied through the palpatory reflexes. The more the reflex is clear, the more the answer is yes, good strategy. You might say that the abdomen is used very much like applied kinesiology muscle testing. There is never an assumption of the correct answer. There is only the constant testing of answers and presenting new questions. The main thrust of all of this is do not clear one finding at a time. Build a strategy. The use of the abdomen as a confirmation is largely about convenience. Though it is not the only way, it is the simplest way to confirm results. It does not require highly specialized skills. It allows the patient to see that the treatment is working, and it is not relying on subjective feelings or judgments of the practitioner. If you happen to be able to confirm results by pulse, that is wonderful. If you can do it by using people's nails, eyebrows, or the fluctuation of the movement of their nostrils, that is wonderful. But for most people, using the abdomen is a lot easier to learn and to apply. Like any other tool or method, the use of palpation can give us options. It can give us freedom and greater clinical success. But it can also bind us and narrow us when we use it too dogmatically. If we use it intelligently, with a flexible, inquiring mind, it will offer us great rewards.